T. James brings us Bigfoot Wars from 2014. And apparently this is actually based on a novel, albeit loosely, and it takes place in Boggy Creek. And by the title you can probably give you some idea about the what to expect from this film. But it's a small kind of American town which has been subjected to a number of animal attacks which are put down to bears. But of course we know different. We know that there are Sasquatches around, and it primarily follows the town's sheriff as he tries to rid this town of its unwanted inhabitants. Eventually his daughter is kidnapped by horny Bigfoots who are wanting to use the town's women folk to replenish their ranks. And he and a small band of people try to go into the woods and take on this Bigfoot menace. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So this movie stars C. Thomas Howell and Judd Nelson, two somewhat recognisable names who, occasionally kind of show up in this kind of low budget fare. Now this is an interesting movie because I think this film is... There's actually has a reasonable amount going for it in many ways, but it also has a seemingly bizarre things that to its detriment. So let me just tell you what I think works in this movie's favour. So you do have a couple of recognisable names here. C. Thomas Howell, Judd Nelson, you've got Billy Blair that shows up. So there are some established actors. And for example, C. Thomas Howell's character is this kind of redneck who ends up kind of helping the sheriff. And I quite liked his character, and I thought we did a pretty decent job here. And there is some other sort of characters I think, are quite sort of interesting in their own right, including the sheriff. So you've got a couple of interesting sort of characters here with some reasonable actors. You've got some pretty decent looking Bigfoot. So, and big feet? What's the plural of Bigfoot? Sasquatches? So we have multiple entities that are out in the kind of the forest, and I've got to say I think the costumes look pretty good. They almost look like huge Neanderthals, and the people that they've got playing them are big, and the costumes look not like store-bought costumes, which is a critique I've levelled at some of these kind of low-budget Bigfoot movies. This one's, I've got to say, I think they look pretty good. They genuinely look like sort of a cross between an ape and a Neanderthal. And they're vicious. These things come out of the kind of the forest and just seemingly kill at random and kidnap the women, basically. So they seem to be overtly aggressive. It's not like people are necessarily going in the forest. These things are actually coming out. So they're particularly aggressive Sasquatches. This movie also has a reasonable amount of fairly kind of well done practical gore here. We see, for example, there's an attack where a couple of Bigfoot creatures are attacking this girl, and they like rip her arms out, and it's kind of like it's an effect that's achieved practically. It looks pretty good. So I think when you look at it from a craft perspective, the Bigfoot creatures look good. The costumes, the makeup looks good. The practical VFX looks good. There's some interesting ideas. It's a lot more kind of like action, I guess, in this movie than maybe some. The attacks are relatively kind of plentiful. There's some kind of somewhat likeable kind of characters here, and some sort of fun sort of action sequences. So why do I sound so hesitant with this movie? So this is a film, and I don't know this for a fact, but this is how it strikes me, as this movie has been butchered in post-production. That's how it seems. Why do I say that? Because it's a relatively short running time. So I can only imagine a lot has been taken out of this, and to sort of support that, there is some really abrasive edits in this movie, especially in the latter half. There's some real rough editing here. There's a sequence, for example, where we've got the sheriff and his deputy, and I think a reporter, sort of coming onto this shack, and they end up having a fight with these Sasquatch creatures, and it's just so poorly edited that the way the camera sort of flits between one scene and another, and then we sort of see reactions to things that we haven't actually seen the cause of, or things like that, or people just seem to be kind of like falling over, and the camera's just like flitting around, and it really feels incredibly choppy. There's also sort of other shots here that just seem to have been out of order and kind of like cut and re-put in, where the scenes aren't matching and things like this. The weather isn't matching. You know, so it just feels like this movie's been hacked to pieces and then kind of like reassembled. So, you know, it's a little bit of a mess, and also just the story, the flow of the story. There are sequences here where you feel like it needed to breathe. There needed to be a little bit of a kind of scenes to kind of expand upon certain sequences, or shots needed to be a little longer. But at the same time, for example, the scene where we first introduce C. Thomas Howell's character is like way too long. So it just seems to me that I think the footage that was shot, the production seems to be relatively strong, but it's the post-production here that really feels like it's just like butchered this movie into its kind of state where it just feels like thrown together. But I actually, considering some of the quality that I think you can see in the actual production, it doesn't look like this movie was filmed like that. It looks like it was put together after the fact. However, there are still some kind of elements here that I think that the movie has that, you know, that could have been better. There's some of the other acting is not so strong. There's characters that just seem to disappear. For example, there's like a guy that the sheriff kind of deputizes, who is kind of like given a badge and like, okay, you know, what's his story gonna be? Nothing. We don't see him again. Okay, so brilliant. So, you know, we have this kind of scene where he's like, I'm going to give up the drink, I'm going to kind of like pull my life back together. Sheriff deputises him, great, okay, what's going to be his up? Don't see him again. Excellent. The sheriff has this kind of monologue that is kind of sort of like, doesn't really make sense when you see the film, let me just say. But also it's wildly distracting, and it just kind of is in some of the scenes when he's in there, and it just got him sort of almost, is he meant to be thinking this? Is he meant to be telling this after the fact, in which case that doesn't really make sense. So the movie is just very messy, which is a shame, because I think the raw footage that's come out of it looks pretty strong. I mean, it's very B-movie and kind of schlocky, but I've got to say I sort of quite liked some of the kind of the stuff I saw. Some of the sequences in isolation I actually think are pretty strong, to be honest. So it's a shame how this movie, I think, is sort of turned up, because I think there's a lot to be said for this movie, you know, that it's a good time. I mean, it's a rough around the edges film for sure, but I think if you like you know, a Bigfoot movie with, it's got a reasonable amount of kind of like you know, attractive women in it. It's got a reasonable amount of gore. It's got plenty of creatures that look pretty good, and even a smattering of likable characters. But it's just sort of like a film that's been thrown together, at least that's how it appears on the outset. So I can't honestly say this is necessarily a good movie, but there's enough to enjoy here for me to give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.
To Asgard and back, my friends!